I stood in the center of our kitchen, holding a crumpled receipt for a $300 tin of sturgeon caviar and a bottle of vintage champagne, while a letter from the bank sat on the counter, informing me that our mortgage application had been rejected due to insufficient down payment funds. My father's life savings, $50,000 intended to be the foundation of our first real home, hadn't just disappeared into thin air. They had been systematically consumed, quite literally, by the woman who called me daughter while sharpening her knives behind my back. The realization didn't hit me like a lightning bolt. It felt more like a slow, icy tide rising around my throat, suffocating the 5 years of trust I had built with the man now standing by the window, refusing to meet my eyes. For years, our life had been a tapestry of quiet, predictable comforts. We lived in a cramped third-floor walk-up that smelled of old paper and the jasmine tea I brewed every morning. Mark was a graphic designer with a gentle soul and a tendency to apologize for things that weren't his fault, and I worked as a freelance academic researcher. We weren't wealthy, but we were happy. Or so I told myself during the long Sunday brunches and the Friday nights spent curled up on a sofa that had seen better decades. Our dream was tangible, a small blue craftsman house with a wraparound porch and a garden where I could finally grow the heirloom tomatoes I'd been reading about for years. The catalyst for this dream was my father, a retired history teacher who had spent 40 years living frugally. When he sold his modest childhood home to move into a senior living community, he sat me down and handed me a check. His hands had been shaking slightly, a side effect of his Parkinson's, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, paternal pride. "This is for your future, Elena," he had whispered, pressing the paper into my palm. "I want you to have the soil beneath your feet that you can call your own. Don't let it sit in a stagnant account. Use it for the house." Mark had been there, his arm wrapped tightly around my shoulder, promising my father that we would honor his sacrifice. We opened a joint high-yield savings account the very next day. It was our sanctuary fund. Every evening, we would look at listings online, pointing out crown moldings and bay windows, whispering about the life we were about to start. Enter Evelyn, my mother-in-law. Evelyn was the widow of a man who had once been a prominent local architect, a man who had left her with a prestigious last name and very little else besides a mountain of hidden debt and a taste for the finer things in life. She was a woman of curated elegance, her silver hair always perfectly coiffed, her silk scarves smelling of expensive French lavender. To the outside world, she was a tragic aristocrat maintaining her dignity. To me, she was a constant, slightly fluttering presence in our lives, a woman who would sigh over the industrial quality of our paper towels or the pedestrian vintage of the wine I bought for dinner. "Oh, Elena, darling," she would say, her voice like honey poured over gravel. "One day you'll understand that the quality of what we consume dictates the quality of our spirit." Mark adored her. He was an only child, raised in the shadow of his father's failures and his mother's grand expectations. He saw her as fragile, a delicate heirloom that needed to be protected from the harshness of a world she wasn't built for. When she complained about her fixed income or the rising cost of her organic specialty groceries, Mark would simply squeeze her hand and tell her not to worry. I tolerated it because I loved him, and because Evelyn, despite her snobbery, seemed harmless. She was just a lonely woman clinging to the ghosts of her past glory. For months, the rhythm of our lives was dictated by the house hunt. We found it in late October, a charming cottage with a sagging porch and a massive oak tree in the backyard. It was perfect. We made an offer, and it was accepted. The excitement was intoxicating. I remember dancing with Mark in our tiny kitchen, the scent of rain-slicked pavement drifting through the open window, feeling like we were finally on the precipice of our real lives. "We need to wire the earnest money and the down payment by Friday," I told him, leaning my head against his chest. "I'll handle it, Elle," he murmured, kissing the top of my head. "I'll go to the bank tomorrow and get everything sorted. You just keep dreaming about that garden." I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was the man who remembered my coffee order and the anniversary of the day we met. But the following Monday, the phone call came. It wasn't the realtor with news of the closing. It was a loan officer from the bank, his voice clipped and professional. "Mrs. Thorne, I'm calling regarding your mortgage application. We've hit a significant snag. Your primary savings account, the one designated for the down payment, doesn't have the funds required to cover the closing costs. In fact, the balance is nearly zero." The world didn't stop, but it certainly slowed down. I remember looking at a small crack in the ceiling, wondering when it had appeared. "That's impossible," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "There should be $54,000 in that account." "There were," the man replied, a hint of pity creeping into his tone. "But there have been dozens of large recurring withdrawals over the last 6 months. Cashier's checks, direct transfers to a boutique grocery service, and several payments to a high-end luxury concierge. The account was drained 3 days ago." I hung up the phone and walked to the small wooden desk in the corner where Mark kept his laptop. My fingers felt like lead as I opened the drawer and found the folder labeled House. Hidden behind the property flyers was a stack of bank statements I hadn't seen. They weren't addressed to our apartment, they were addressed to a P.O. box I didn't recognize. I flipped through them, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Thousands of dollars spent at the Gilded Larder, a shop that sold $20 butter and gold-leafed chocolates, payments for private car services, a $5,000 membership fee to a social club Evelyn had mentioned wanting to join. And then I found it. A handwritten note tucked into the back of the folder. It was Evelyn's elegant, loopy script. "Dearest Mark, the truffles were divine, and the chef you sent over for my luncheon was a master. Thank you for taking care of your mother. It's so much better that this money goes toward living a beautiful life now, rather than sitting in some cold bank vault for a house you don't even need yet. Elena is young. She has time to save more. Your father would be so proud of the man you've become." I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from falling. My father's sweat, his years of teaching in overcrowded classrooms, his literal legacy was gone. It hadn't been stolen by a stranger. It had been handed away, piece by piece, by the man I shared a bed with, to satisfy the gluttony of a woman who thought a beautiful life was measured in imported caviar and silk scarves. When the front door clicked open and Mark walked in, humming a soft tune, carrying a bouquet of cheap supermarket daisies, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply held up the receipt for the sturgeon caviar, the paper white and accusing in the afternoon light. "My father gave us money to build a life, Mark," I said, my voice a low, dangerous vibration. "And your mother spent it on luxury food? Tell me I'm hallucinating. Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Mark froze. The daisies slipped from his hand, scattering on the floor like discarded hopes. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, his shoulders slouching in that familiar, apologetic posture that I suddenly realized was his greatest weapon of cowardice. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator, the same refrigerator that was currently empty of everything but a carton of cheap milk and the bitter realization that my marriage was a house built on sand. Looking back, the warning signs weren't just red flags. They were a god-awful neon display I had chosen to ignore because I wanted to believe in the sanctity of my marriage. It started about 6 months ago, right after my father's check cleared. Evelyn, who usually treated our apartment like a transit lounge for her more important social engagements, suddenly became a frequent visitor. She didn't come to help or to bond. She came to inspect. "Oh, Marky," she'd coo, running a manicured finger over our laminate countertops. "It's so quaint how you live, but a man of your talent deserves to be surrounded by excellence. How can you design masterpieces while breathing in the scent of cheap detergent?" Mark would just laugh nervously, but I saw the way his face fell. A few weeks later, his behavior began to shift. He started keeping his phone face down on the table, a classic move I dismissed as him trying to be more present. Then there were the late-night consultations with his mother. I'd wake up at 2 a.m. to find the living room glowing with the blue light of his laptop and hear him whispering into his headset. "I know, Mom. I know you need it. It's just..." Elena is really counting on that specific amount for the closing costs. Are you sure you can't wait? When I'd walk in, he'd snap the laptop shut so hard I feared for the screen. "Just work stuff, Elle. Go back to sleep," he'd say, his voice tight with a tension he couldn't hide. I told myself it was the stress of the house hunt. I told myself that being an only child to a demanding widow was a burden I couldn't understand. I chose to be supportive instead of suspicious. I was an idiot. The most glaring sign came during a Sunday dinner at Evelyn's rent-controlled apartment, which she treated like a palace in exile. She had served a spread that looked like it belonged in a high-end food magazine: Wagyu beef, white truffles shaved over handmade pasta, and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. "Evelyn, this is incredible," I had said, taking a bite of the beef. "Did you win the lottery?" She gave me a thin, patronizing smile. "One doesn't need a lottery to live well, Elena. One simply needs to prioritize. Mark understands that, don't you, darling?" Mark didn't look at me. He was busy meticulously cutting his steak. "Mom's right, Elle. Life is short. Why wait for a someday house to enjoy the best things?" "Because that someday house is our future," I replied, a cold pit forming in my stomach. "And we're using my father's retirement money to secure it. We can't afford to prioritize truffles right now." The silence that followed was heavy. Evelyn's eyes flickered with a brief, sharp malice before she masked it with a sigh. "Of course, how practical of you. My apologies for wanting to share a beautiful moment with my family." That night, Mark was silent in the car. When I tried to bring it up, he snapped. "Can't you just let her have this? She's lost everything. Her husband, her status. If a nice dinner makes her feel human again, why do you have to be so accountant-like about it?" "It's not about the dinner, Mark. It's about where the money is coming from," I shouted back. "It's fine, Elena. I'm handling it." He was handling it, all right. He was handling the systematic looting of our future. The point of no return arrived on a Tuesday morning that started out perfectly ordinary. I was at my desk, finishing a research paper on 19th century land grants, when the bank called. The loan officer's words, "The balance is nearly zero," didn't just break my heart, they shattered my entire perception of reality. I remember the physical sensation of the blood draining from my face. My skin felt suddenly too tight for my bones. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt a strange, terrifying hollowness, as if I had been hollowed out from the inside. I stood up, and my legs felt like they belonged to a marionette with frayed strings. I walked to Mark's desk. My hand hovered over the drawer. I felt like a trespasser in my own home, but the need for the truth was a physical hunger. When I pulled out that hidden folder and saw the statements, the room began to spin. Withdrawal, $4,000. Withdrawal, $2,500. Withdrawal, $6,000. Each line was a stab. Each date corresponded to a time Mark had told me he was working late, or that he had found a great deal on some gadget he brought home for his mother. But the receipts from the Gilded Larder were the worst. They were itemized lists of his betrayal. Organic saffron, beluga caviar, rare aged cheeses. While my father was eating canned soup to save every penny for us, Evelyn was dining like a queen on his dime. And then I saw the most recent statement. 3 days ago, the day we were supposed to wire the earnest money, Mark had transferred the final $10,000, not to the escrow account, but to a private account in Evelyn's name. The note from Evelyn, the one thanking him for the beautiful life, was the final nail. My hand shook so violently the paper rattled. I felt a surge of heat behind my eyes, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, a cold, crystalline anger began to settle in my chest. When the door opened and Mark walked in with those supermarket daisies, I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated loathing. He looked so pathetic, standing there with his "I'm sorry" flowers, while he had effectively sold my father's legacy for a few months of his mother's approval. "I called the bank, Mark," I said, my voice sounding distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. He stopped mid-stride. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. "Elle, I can explain." "Explain what?" I held up the statement, my thumb pressing into the paper until it tore. "Explain the caviar? Explain the $5,000 for a social club membership? Explain how you watched me talk about that blue house every single night, knowing you were giving the down payment to your mother so she could play aristocrat?" "She was depressed, Elena. She felt like she had nothing left," he blurted out, his voice cracking. I thought we'd have time to make it up. I'm doing extra freelance work. I was going to put it back before you noticed." "Put back $50,000? I stepped toward him, and for the first time in our relationship, he actually flinched. "On a graphic designer's salary? Are you delusional or just a liar?" "It's just money, Elle. We can get more." "It's not just money," I screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet apartment. "It's my father's life. He worked 40 years for this. He has Parkinson's, Mark. He gave us this so I wouldn't have to worry about him, and so we could have a home. And you gave it to that woman so she could eat gold leaf chocolate?" I threw the sturgeon caviar receipt at his feet. "Look at it, Mark. Look at what you traded our future for. Does it taste like betrayal? Because that's all I can taste right now." He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while the daisies lay scattered on the floor between us, a perfect metaphor for the ruins of our life. The silence that followed my outburst was heavy, a suffocating blanket of shame and cowardice. Mark didn't move to pick up the flowers. He didn't even move to close the door behind him. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the linoleum floor, his breathing shallow and ragged. "Say something, Mark," I whispered, the coldness in my voice surprising even me. "Tell me you didn't know. Tell me she stole the login credentials. Tell me you're as horrified as I am." He finally looked up, but there was no horror in his eyes. There was only a weary, defensive irritation that made my blood run cold. "Elena, you're overreacting. It's a lot of money, yes, but it's not the end of the world. My mother was in a dark place. She was being hounded by creditors from Dad's old estate, things I didn't even know about. She was going to lose her dignity. I couldn't let that happen." "Her dignity?" I stepped closer, the smell of the supermarket daisies now cloying and sickening. "She bought a $300 tin of caviar, Mark. She joined a $5,000 social club. That's not settling creditors. That's a shopping spree on my father's grave." "She needed to maintain appearances," he snapped, finally finding his voice, though it was high and brittle. "If people knew how broke she was, she'd lose everything. Her social circle is all she has left. I thought we could just delay the house by a year. What's 1 year in the grand scheme of things?" "A year?" I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my throat. "The money is gone, Mark, all of it. And you didn't delay anything. You stole it. You stood in that kitchen with my father. You looked that man with Parkinson's in the eye, and you promised to protect his legacy, while you were already planning how to hand it over to your mother's florist." "I didn't plan it," he yelled, but his eyes flickered toward his laptop. I pushed past him, my heart racing. I grabbed his laptop from the desk. He lunged for it, but I was faster, fueled by a shot of pure, undiluted adrenaline. I retreated behind the kitchen island, the screen still glowing. "Elena, give it back, that's private," he hissed, his face contorting. I wasn't looking at his work files. I was looking at his sent folder. And there, dated 3 weeks before my father even gave us the check, was an email to Evelyn. "Don't worry, Mom. Elena's dad is selling the house soon. He's going to give her a massive lump sum. I'll make sure the joint account is set up so I have full transfer authority. We'll get those debts cleared and get you back on your feet. Just hang in there. Don't tell Elena. She's a bit sensitive about finances right now." The world didn't just tilt, it inverted. This wasn't a moment of weakness. It wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a calculated, premeditated conspiracy. My husband had been shopping my father's life savings to his mother before the money even existed. "You predatory coward," I breathed. The nausea was back, a hot, oily wave. "You didn't just let her take it. You offered it to her like a sacrifice." Mark went suddenly quiet. He dropped the apologetic son act and a mask of cold, hard resentment settled over his features. "He's an old man, Elena. He doesn't need $50,000. He's in a home. He's taken care of. We're the ones who have to live in this world. And my mother is a thorn. She shouldn't have to live like a beggar because your father decided to be a martyr." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys and my coat, the bank statements clutched in my hand like a weapon. "Where are you going?" he demanded, stepping toward me. "To see the Thorn matriarch," I said, my voice echoing with a strange, hollow power. "I want to see if the caviar tastes like my father's sweat." I drove to Evelyn's apartment in a trance. The city lights blurred into long neon streaks. When I arrived, I didn't knock. I had a key, the key she had insisted I have so I could bring her things when she was feeling frail. I burst into her living room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive candles and roasted lamb. Evelyn was sitting on her velvet chaise longue, a glass of dark red wine in one hand and a catalog for a boutique hotel in the Maldives in the other. She looked up, her expression shifting from surprise to a practiced, bored elegance. "Elena? This is rather abrupt. I was just about to have dinner." "I bet you were," I said, slamming the bank statements onto her mahogany coffee table, right next to a silver bowl filled with imported marzipan. "I know everything, Evelyn. I know about the gilded larder. I know about the social club. And I know about the email Mark sent you months ago." Evelyn didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her eyes tracking me over the rim of the glass. "Mark has always been a very devoted son. He understands that family has obligations that transcend mundane paperwork." "Obligations?" I stepped closer, my shadow falling over her. "That money belonged to my father. It was his life's work. You didn't just take money, Evelyn. You took my home. You took my security. You took my trust in my husband." "Oh, don't be so dramatic, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're a young woman. You can work. You can save. I, on the other hand, am at a stage where comfort is a necessity, not a luxury. Besides," she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, "Mark felt he owed me. I spent a fortune on his education, on his clothes, on making sure he was the kind of man a girl like you would even want to marry. Consider this a reimbursement." "A reimbursement?" I whispered. "For raising your own son? You're a parasite, Evelyn. You've bled him dry of his character, and now you've bled my family dry of their future." "Careful, Elena," she purred, the sweetness in her voice turning to poison. "Mark is a thorn, and thorns stick together. If you make this unpleasant, you'll find yourself very alone, very quickly. I've already told everyone in our circle that your father's money was a gift to us, to help me with my medical expenses after your father's unfortunate decline. People will believe me. I have the name. You're just the girl from the suburbs who married up." The room felt like it was shrinking. The second twist hit me then. She hadn't just spent the money. She had already begun the character assassination. She was setting the stage to make me look like the cruel, heartless daughter-in-law who was begrudging a sick woman her medical care. Just then the door opened. Mark walked in, looking exhausted and small. He looked at me, then at his mother, and then he did the one thing I knew he would do. He walked over to her side. He didn't stand in the middle. He didn't try to mediate. He stood behind her chair, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Elena, please," he said, his voice pleading but his position clear. "Just let it go. We'll make it back. I'll work double shifts. We can stay in the apartment another 2 years. Just don't do this to Mom. She can't handle the stress." I looked at them, the devoted son and the fragile mother, two predators cloaked in silk and apologies. I looked at the bottle of wine that cost more than my father's weekly medication. "You're right, Mark," I said, my voice suddenly as calm as a frozen lake. "She can't handle the stress, and neither can you." "Does that mean you're going to be reasonable?" Evelyn asked, a triumphant glint in her eyes. I looked her dead in the eye, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of doubt in her gaze. "No," I said. "It means I'm done being the only one in this room with a conscience. You want to talk about thorn pride? Let's see how much pride you have left when the police ask you about the forged signatures on the wire transfer authorizations." Mark's hand dropped from her shoulder. "What? What are you talking about?" "I checked the joint account settings while I had your laptop, Mark," I said, lied through my teeth with a conviction that terrified me. "You didn't have full authority. You needed my digital signature for transfers over $5,000, which means you either hacked my account or you forged my identity. And since I have the logs of the IP addresses used for those transfers, I think the district attorney will find it very interesting." In reality, I didn't know if he'd forged anything yet, but the look of pure, unadulterated terror that flashed across Mark's face told me everything I needed to know. He had. "Elena, wait," Mark started, his voice a pathetic squeak. "The only thing I'm waiting for," I said, turning toward the door, "is to see which one of you turns on the other first when the handcuffs come out." I walked out of that apartment, the sound of their sudden, panicked arguing ringing in my ears like the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The transformation had begun. The victim was dead. The hunter was born. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. I couldn't bear the thought of breathing the same air as the man who had traded my father's life for his mother's vanity. I checked into a sterile, quiet hotel room, the kind with white sheets and no history. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room was a mirror to the silence in my soul. The click happened then, not an explosion of rage, but a chilling, crystalline settling of purpose. My love for Mark hadn't just died, it had been surgically removed. I realized then that he hadn't been a man struggling with a difficult mother. He was a willing accomplice in a slow-motion heist. The next morning, I didn't call him. I didn't answer the 37 frantic texts or the dozen voicemails that transitioned from, "Elena, please come home," to, "You're being cruel to my mother." Instead, I called Sarah, a friend from university who specialized in forensic accounting. "I need you to look at some statements, Sarah," I told her, my voice steady, "and I need a recommendation for a divorce attorney who handles financial fraud. I don't want a settlement, I want a reckoning." Over the next 2 weeks, while Mark and Evelyn were likely patting themselves on the back for weathering the storm, I was building a cage. Sarah found exactly what I suspected. Mark had used a digital overlay of my signature to authorize the larger transfers, a clumsy but effective forgery. Even worse, he had been funneling a portion of his own salary into a secret account to pay off Evelyn's high-interest credit cards, debts she had racked up at luxury boutiques while claiming she was destitute. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the girl dreaming of heirloom tomatoes. I was a woman documenting a crime. The retribution came on the night of the autumn gala at the Rosewood Social Club, the very club Evelyn had used my father's money to join. She was in her element, draped in a new silk wrap that I knew, with a sickening certainty, had been paid for by my father's teaching pension. Mark was there, looking uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo, playing the role of the dutiful, successful son. I didn't sneak in. I walked through the front door with my attorney and a plainclothes detective I had spent 3 days convincing to take my statement. The room was a sea of glittering chandeliers and the clink of crystal. When Evelyn saw me, she didn't look afraid. She looked annoyed. She adjusted her pearls and glided toward me, a shark in chiffon. "Elena, really?" she whispered, her voice a sharp hiss. "This is a private event. You are making a scene. Go home and we can talk about your allowance tomorrow." "I'm not here for an allowance, Evelyn," I said, loud enough for the surrounding guests to turn their heads. "I'm here for the $54,000 you and your son stole from a man with Parkinson's to pay for your membership in this room." The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute. I saw Mark freeze near the buffet, a plate of hors d'oeuvres in his hand. He looked like a deer caught in high beams. "How dare you?" Evelyn gasped, her face flushing a mottled purple. "I told you, that money was a gift for my medical care. Mark told everyone." "Mark lied," I interrupted, pulling a thick folder from my bag. "And so did you. Here are the itemized receipts from the Gilded Larder. Here are the credit card statements showing your medical expenses were actually purchases at Hermes and Chanel. And here, I said, holding up a high-resolution printout, is the proof that Mark forged my signature to move the money. I turned to the detective. That's the man, and that's the woman who received the stolen funds. The next hour was a blur of beautiful, cold justice. Mark tried to scramble toward me, his face a mask of desperation. "Elena, I did it for us. I did it so she wouldn't ruin our reputation." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. "You didn't do it for us, Mark. You did it because you're a coward who would rather rob a sick old man than stand up to a woman who uses you like an ATM. You didn't protect our reputation. You destroyed it." As the detective led Mark toward the exit for questioning, and the club manager asked a hysterical, shrieking Evelyn to leave the premises immediately, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The Thorn name was mud by morning. The social circle Evelyn had sacrificed everything to keep slammed their doors in her face before the sun came up. The legal process was grueling, but I didn't flinch. Mark, faced with felony forgery charges, folded instantly. He gave up his mother, testifying that she had pressured him into the transfers. In the end, he received a suspended sentence and 5 years of probation, but his career as a designer was over. No firm would touch a man with a fraud conviction. Evelyn was forced to sell her remaining jewelry and move into a tiny, state-subsidized apartment in a neighborhood she would have previously called unrefined. My father's money was eventually recovered through the liquidation of Mark's retirement account and the sale of everything in our apartment. 6 months later, I sat on the porch of a small cottage. It wasn't the blue house I had first dreamed of. It was better. It was a white farmhouse with a wide garden that I had bought with my own savings and the returned legacy of my father. My father was sitting in a rocker next to me, his hands still shaking, but his smile was steady. We were watching the sunset over the rows of heirloom tomatoes I had finally planted. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine. I picked up my phone to see a final email from Mark, sent from a burner account. "I'm living in a studio now. Mom won't speak to me. I lost everything for her, and she hates me for not giving her more. I still love you, Elle. Can we just talk?" I didn't hit reply. I didn't even feel the urge to cry. I simply deleted the message and blocked the number. I looked at my father, who was watching a goldfinch land on the bird feeder. He looked at peace. I realized then that the money hadn't been the gift. The gift was the strength I had found to protect what was mine. Some people think a beautiful life is something you buy in a jar or wear around your neck. But as I watched the shadows lengthen over my own soil, I knew the truth. A beautiful life isn't something you consume. It's something you defend. And in the end, the caviar was gone, but the ground beneath my feet was finally, irrevocably, mine.